I'm Cecily Dyer, Special Collections Librarian at Pequot Library, and I want to thank you for joining today's program, presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, The Tinderbox of the Civil War, 1830s Abolitionism in Connecticut. I'm delighted to welcome our two guests today. Dr. Manisha Sinha is author of The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, a groundbreaking history of the largely forgotten role of Black Americans in emancipation, and a book that was central to our research for the current exhibition. Of her newest book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, the New York Times Book Review has written, Sinha not only has taken on this vast subject, but has greatly expanded its definition, both temporally and spatially. She covers these difficult issues with remarkable skill and clarity. And I do want to mention that we have both books available for sale at the back table, and Dr. Sinha will be available for signing at the end too. Dr. Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She's joined in conversation today by Dr. Katherine Hermes, Professor Emeritus at Central Connecticut State University and Executive Director and Publisher of the fantastic magazine of Connecticut History, Connecticut Explored, which she graciously brought for visitors today to take for free. That's also on the back table. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sinha and Dr. Hermes. And you probably need to turn your mic on.
These are deep. Gonna sink into them. Well, it's wonderful to be here today at the Pequot Library. Can you hear me? No? Okay, hold on. Can you hear me now? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. All right. Wonderful to be here today at the Pequot Library and to be in conversation with Manisha Sinha, such a great scholar, about this very exciting but difficult topic of abolition and enslavement. So I'm going to start right out with some of the history of this, and I hope that you have all seen the exhibit or you're going to see the exhibit after this conversation. First, I want to talk a little bit about Connecticut's long history of emancipation, because as I understand from your book, The Slave's Cause, in a chapter called The Long Northern Emancipation, in 1784, Connecticut copied Pennsylvania's approach to emancipation and freed the children of enslaved people, but not the parents. And I wonder if you can explain more about the law and why Connecticut chose this path as opposed to just outlawing slavery outright.
Yeah, that's a great question. Firstly, thank you, Cecily, for the kind introduction, and to Southport for hosting us today, and Kathy for being here. Connecticut, like most northern states, adopted a policy of gradual emancipation. And that was basically freeing the children of enslaved people rather than enslaved people themselves. And not only would they not become free immediately, that's children, they had to reach adulthood in order to become free. In Connecticut, I think it was the age of 25. For Rhode Island, which passed a gradual emancipation law the same year, it was a little lower, I think it was around 21. So the idea was that somehow the enslaved would repay their enslavers for their upkeep, and that they would provide them with labor the prime years of their life and then become free. So the gradual emancipation laws really balanced what many people in government at that time, both at the state, at the different state levels in the North, thought of balancing the slaveholders' right to property, his human property, with the enslaved's right to liberty. And there were states that did not follow the gradual road. You had Massachusetts, where two enslaved people sued their enslavers for their freedom. And they managed to get the state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court, to basically say that slavery was illegal according to the new state constitution that they had. So my students at the University of Massachusetts were always very fascinated by the fact that abolition in Massachusetts came about not because of any state law or any action by the state government, but because two ordinary enslaved people chose to sue for their freedom. Similarly, in Vermont, the state constitution abolished slavery. So these were instances of immediate abolition. But Connecticut chose to follow the gradual road, which was set by Pennsylvania. And this became problematic because many enslavers in the North, including in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, tried to sell off their slaves to the South before they could free them, so that they would recuperate the money for that. So then they had to pass additional laws prohibiting that, both in Rhode Island and in Pennsylvania. In Connecticut, they don't pass a law until 1848, where they free a handful of remaining slaves. So the process is very gradual, it's slow, but yes, that's what makes Connecticut a free state on the eve of the Civil War.
Yeah, it's just amazing that it's 1848 before everyone is free.
A handful, according to the census.
Yeah.
But still, the fact that it persists, I mean, in New Jersey, there were enslaved people right up to 1860.
Wow.
And then they had to somehow convert them into, quote, lifetime servants. Because New Jersey was the last state to pass a gradual emancipation law in 1804. It's also the only northern state that did not give all its electoral votes to Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
Fascinating.
A laggard.
Yeah. And I imagine, Connecticut has such a reputation as an abolitionist state now. A lot of people think everyone in Connecticut was abolitionist. We're going to find out that's not quite so. But often abolitionists talked about as a white movement. But you say very clearly in your book, quote, "The desire of blacks for freedom was the dominant force behind revolutionary emancipation," and that, quote, "African Americans initiated and enforced emancipation." So one thing I'd like to clear up here is, what's the difference, if there is one, between abolition and emancipation? And maybe some of these other terms, like what's anti-slavery versus abolition?
Those are very good questions. Emancipation is usually the process that we describe when the state issues an emancipation law. Abolition really refers to the radical social movement that consisted of both whites and blacks. And the first wave of abolition, which was during the Revolutionary era, the late 18th century, early 19th century, in what I call the first wave of abolition, which resulted in the abolition of the African slave trade and emancipation in the northern states. In that era, we see that most of the abolition societies, including the one that was founded in Connecticut in 1790, tended to be whites-only societies. African Americans were not part of that society. But as I argue in my book, that doesn't mean that African Americans weren't involved in the abolition movement. In fact, in many cases, as in the case of Massachusetts that I just referred to, they're the ones who begin the process of emancipation by petitioning for their freedom, by suing for their freedom. This tradition of freedom suits and freedom petitions is really important, because it's only with that many white abolitionists who are their allies get involved, either as their lawyers in courtrooms or in the state houses, presenting their petitions and endorsing them, and then forming these formal abolition societies. In Pennsylvania, you had a very active Quaker group that kind of led the abolition movement, but it did so in conjunction with free black people. So when people say, well, you really emphasize the role of African Americans in initiating the process of emancipation, I do that because that's what the historical record basically told me. I would read white abolitionist pamphlets and they would reproduce the words of black petitioners to colonial legislatures and state legislatures. So the white abolitionists at that time understood where the impulse is coming from. It's historians later on, and particularly in the antebellum period during the second wave of abolition, Southerners like to portray abolition as a northern white movement, people who knew nothing about slavery and were unnecessarily meddling in their affairs. They tended to ignore African Americans. And the historians who wrote about abolition initially tended to be pretty unsympathetic to the movement. They saw them as these radical, fanatical extremists who caused the Civil War, which was an unnecessary war, that they inflamed feelings when there was no need to do that, as these kind of armchair philosophers who did not really know anything about slavery. And I was really writing against that very long tradition of dismissing the abolition movement and really highlighting the role of African Americans in the colonial era in initiating abolition, even though they were not formally a part of many of these abolition societies.
Yeah, and I think this raises a point for me that, of course, the abolitionists in the North weren't ignorant of enslavement because it did exist here. And not just, I don't mean just the handful in 1848, but for centuries, there had been enslaved blacks and fairly large populations, isn't that right?
Absolutely. On the eve of the American Revolution, slavery was legal in all the 13 colonies. There was not any colony that did not recognize slavery. The North did not have those elaborate slave codes that the plantation colonies in the South and in the British West Indies had, but they definitely had laws that legalized slavery. In fact, the first colonial law that legalizes slavery is from Massachusetts, the 1641 Bodies of Liberties that legitimized the enslavement of Native Americans as, quote, strangers, prisoners of war, and as heathens. And so the North definitely had a long history of slavery, and the idea that they decided to just abolish slavery because it was not economically significant is also incorrect, because the largest slave population, urban population, outside Charleston, South Carolina, was New York City. And you had slavery in the farming counties, in the Hudson River Valley, Narragansett River Valley, Connecticut River Valley. Slave labor was used, both for domestic service and for farm labor, widely.
I want to go back to this issue of historians kind of ignoring black agency and action for a long time, because it's not just 19th century historians, it's right up to the present day till you and some others. I'm not saying you're alone in this, but it's been a very long gap, really, before historians started to hear those voices. What changed in the historical profession?
Yeah, this shows us how we historians write at different moments in time when we are quite influenced by the events around us, right? Now we know that that's true even for science. And what really changes is, well, one thing I should say as a caveat, that African Americans always remembered the role of black abolitionists.
Yeah.
They weren't forgotten by African American scholars and activists. The first compilations of literature on black abolitionists was done by black abolitionists themselves. They wrote the first black histories. And then when the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now called African American Life and History, is founded in the early 20th century, when basically mainstream academia was dominated by lost cause mythologies and complete misinterpretations of slavery. They were writing these histories, but it was ignored till the Second World War, when Nazism made racism unfashionable, and you start having new histories of the Civil War and abolition being written. But it's really not until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, when many civil rights activists called themselves the new abolitionists, and their struggle, the second reconstruction of American democracy, referring to the first reconstruction after the Civil War, that you started having activists and scholars really pay attention to the role of African Americans in the movement and writing more sympathetic histories of abolition. But that was a very short period. And when I was a graduate student, for instance, a very long time ago, the dominant view of abolitionists by then was, oh, these were these northern white middle class people. They were very conservative on economic matters. They were racially paternalistic. It was kind of dismissive of the movement, and that was the dominant interpretation when I wrote my book. Now, there were people writing separate books about women abolitionists, about African American abolitionists, but no one had really taken that material to kind of reevaluate the movement as a whole. And that's why I ended up writing this book for a long time. It ended up being quite big because there were so many forgotten figures, particularly Black abolitionists, who were really pioneers when it came to tactics and strategies of the movement.
And I'm also glad that you raised this about Black historians, because we actually will have an article in the summer issue of Connecticut Explored about Lorenzo Green, who worked with Carter Woodson and was a historian. He was born in Ansonia here and was one of the first Black historians to really write about New England slavery and abolition. Yeah.
I read his book, Blacks in New England, when I was in grad school. You're right. I mean, these people were literally laboring and preserving that history, which was so important.
So I want to go to the exhibit here, which is really wonderful. And it's called The Tinderbox of the Civil War. And it starts in the 1830s. Can you tell us a little bit about what's so pivotal about the 1830s?
So the 1830s are really important for the history of abolition, but also for the coming of the Civil War. We call it the start of the antebellum period, which is, of course, just a fancy way of saying the period before the Civil War. And it really is in the 1830s that the abolition movement, the second wave, takes off. We all know about the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator in 1831 in Boston. But as I was researching my book at the Boston Public Library, in the Garrison papers, in his private and public materials, he refers to African American abolitionists from the 1820s who had inspired him to oppose the colonization movement, which is mentioned here. Connecticut was a big stronghold of the colonization movement. Their plan was simply to get rid of Black people, right? It was not just to end slavery, but take all free Black people from the upper South states, a lot of them had been manumitted during the Revolutionary era, and from the North, and simply send them all back to Africa. And the abolition movement, particularly African Americans, opposed this. They wanted not just an end to slavery, but also to racial segregation in the North, and they wanted Black citizenship, which becomes the main issue of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So they're fighting for this in the 1830s. Now, this makes them very unpopular in the North. Abolitionist societies and meetings are seen as, quote, promiscuous, because men and women, Blacks and whites, participate in it together. And they arouse a lot of mob violence and opposition. I mean, we know the famous cases in Connecticut. Connecticut was called the Georgia of New England because it was most opposed to abolition, because colonization was so strong here. In 1831, the New Haven College, there's a sort of a meeting of the town, and everyone rejects the idea of having a college open to African Americans. In 1833, of course, we know what happens to Prudence Crandall School in Canterbury. They have a wonderful museum now for Prudence Crandall in Canterbury that I always encourage my students to go there. It's a small one, but it's really good. It's not just about Crandall, but also her Black students who went on to become prominent abolitionists and civil rights activists in the South after the Civil War themselves. So it's a wonderful museum. I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I had no idea until that exhibit that there were so many students. I sort of thought of it as like one or two students, and it closed quickly, but there's actually quite a long legacy of those students. Yeah.
Because what happens is when she admits her first Black students, the white students withdraw, and she says she wants to make a school just for black students. So she reopens it and she advertises it for African American women from all over the North. And that's when the state of Connecticut passes a law saying you can't come into, if you're a black woman, you can't come into the state for education. And of
Wow.
course they attack the school. But what's pivotal about the 1830s is important, is that when the abolition movement takes off in the 1830s, all this occurs not just in Connecticut and New England, but all over the North. There are mob attacks. We've all heard about the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, the throwing of his press in the river. And increasingly, Northerners start connecting the abolition movement, which was a movement that was still a minority movement at that time, but they start connecting it with civil liberties, with freedom of assembly, speech, and press, and with the fate of American democracy. And this is when the slaves' cause in the North really gets linked to the issue of the future of American democracy. So you could read a speech by Abraham Lincoln in 1837, his so-called Lyceum speech, when he's just a small town lawyer, and he's talking about the attacks on abolitionists. And he raises the question of civil liberties and the future of American democracy. Now, Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He's an anti-slavery moderate. But they're increasingly making this connection in the North. So what I try to say is that the 1830s is pivotal in getting sort of wider sort of anti-slavery fellow travelers for the abolitionist movement. Because the argument was, oh, this was just a minority movement composed mainly of black people and women, and a handful of radicals. It was inconsequential. But in fact, they seed the ground for the rise of political anti-slavery. And that's why I like the title of this exhibition. Whoever came up with it, kudos to them, Tinderbox, the Civil War, because in a way it really did awaken the eyes of, it did awaken a lot of Northerners, open their eyes to the fact that that slavery was not just a matter of black freedom, because a lot of them were not that sympathetic to that idea, but also to the very fate of American democracy and the liberties maybe of Northern white citizens as well.
It's interesting that this concern about perpetuating democracy in America goes so far back, and still remains.
Exactly. It's, I don't think we repeat history as such, but we live with those legacies. And especially when I wrote my book on Reconstruction, where I talked about Reconstruction as abolition democracy, because if you look at the first federal civil rights laws, the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which is much in debate right now, you'll see that those ideas were already being proposed by black and white abolitionists in the 1830s.
And I want to connect up the question of suffrage with abolition. In Rhode Island and Connecticut, before the Revolution and maybe after the Revolution for a while, black men could vote. Some black men could vote. But in each state, they lost that right in the 19th century. In Connecticut, between 1812 and the Constitution of 1818, and in Rhode Island in 1822. So can you connect the dots for us? What's the connection between slavery, suffrage, abolition?
Such an important question, because as I said earlier, we think of abolition, we think of just a movement opposed to the existence of slavery. But if you look at the Declaration of the American Anti-Slavery Society, they're demanding black political and civic equality. Programmatically, they're committed to black citizenship. That means the right to vote also. Now, the New England states are the only northern states that do give black men the right to vote right up to the Civil War, except Connecticut. Now, Rhode Island in the 1840s extended the right to vote to black men, but Connecticut did not. It's not until the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution in 1870 that enfranchised an overwhelming majority of African American men that lived in the South, that in Connecticut, you have the right to vote given to black men. What's weird about Connecticut is that black men with property could vote. Black men with property could vote in the early American Republic. Anyone who says, oh, in the early American Republic, only white men could vote, that's actually incorrect. If you met the property holding qualifications for voting, you could vote if you were a man, black or white, all through the country. It's only with the spread of Jacksonian democracy that removes property holding qualifications for white men. This happens in Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, that they add a racial qualification, saying they introduce the word white. Only white men can vote. So the Connecticut Constitution of 1818 introduces that word, white, which the founders did not have, either in the US Constitution or in many of the state constitutions. That racial qualification is put in place. In New York, they take away the $250 property holding qualification for white men, but they retain it for black men. So in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, they just disenfranchise black men completely. And then in Connecticut, they have two referendums. Once you have the emergence of an anti-slavery Republican Party, and for those of you who are very confused, everything you know about the two parties, politically and ideologically, you just need to flip it to the 19th century. I get a lot of confused looks from people when I say that the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, anti-slavery, racial liberalism, and big government, the expansion of the federal government. The Democratic Party was the pro-slavery states' rights party at that time. So when the Republican Party emerges, they actually put forward referendums in Connecticut to give black men the right to vote. And they're always defeated by smaller margins, but they're still defeated. So Connecticut, black men don't have the right to vote right up to 1870, which is why Garrison called it the Georgia of New England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think? I'm going to throw in a question I didn't give you ahead of time. But I noticed in the exhibition, they have a section on the Amistad trial. And of course, that's a big event in Connecticut history, although I have to admit, again, when I was in even graduate school was the first time I heard of the Amistad case. And so it was not well known, I would say, in textbooks and things. It wasn't in the textbooks before the 1990s, I would guess. But is the Amistad case important for abolition writ large, and why, or why not?
Yeah, it's extremely important. One of the arguments that I make in the Slaves' Cause is that when we think of abolition as this interracial movement, most people who had written before me talked only about free black men and women in the North. But in fact, you need to look at slave resistance as an important component of the abolition movement, especially with the fugitive slave issue. Some of the most famous abolitionists who come to lead the abolition movement in the 1840s and 50s were fugitive slaves, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are only the most famous of them. There were a whole bunch of them. But besides this, I talked about abolition, or the notion of slave resistance being important to abolition, by looking at what I call shipboard rebellions. And these were, places on the ocean that are liminal spaces, in the sense that, what law applies there, what international law applies there, or is it the laws of the free states of the North, or of the slave states. Now, the Amistad, of course, was a ship that had come from West Africa and was trafficking in West Africans to Cuba. And it was going from Havana to a sugar plantation, when the Africans on board rise up in revolt and successfully commandeer the ship. But they asked to be taken back to Africa. And the ship's captain is killed, but the other Spanish and Cuban crew steer towards Long Island in the United States. And from Long Island, the ship is towed to New London, So it becomes a case in Connecticut. And what's interesting about this case, again, shows you the way the abolition movement worked, right? A local abolitionist, Connecticut abolitionist, pretty like ordinary guy, no one's heard of his, Dwight James is his name. So one of my pet peeves with the movie by Steven Spielberg, Amistad, he just like makes up people. I'm like, there were actual people there. There was you didn't have to make up a black abolitionist. There was James W.C. Pennington, prominent black abolitionist in Hartford, or this guy. I mean, they were actually, you could just do a little bit of research and portray them historically instead of just making up fictitious people. In any case, I guess that's why I'm a historian, not a filmmaker. But, you know, they make it into, he alerts the Tappans in New York City. They form an Amistad committee immediately to represent the Africans. And who do they go to? They go to anti-slavery lawyers. You know, someone like Roger Sherman, he's like descendant of a prominent revolutionary family. They go to John Quincy Adams, former president, to represent them in the Supreme Court. And they win the freedom of these Africans, Mendi Africans. And there's a portrait made of Singbepe, who's called Sinke, but that's his African name. And it becomes, you know, just like in the Abolitionist Hall of Fame, literally. And what was interesting to me was to see not just abolitionists, but moderate anti-slavery men like Baldwin, like Quincy Adams, actually, you know, defending a slave's right to rebel in self-defense and saying, look, the African slave trade is illegal, and they are just fighting for their natural rights of life and liberty. And so this was quite remarkable. You know, John Quincy Adams is hated by Southerners because he's always trying to present abolitionist petitions in Congress, and they have a gag rule against that. And soon after that, you have the Creole shipboard slave rebellion again. So these two cases, the Creole and the Amistad, really raised the question of slavery in terms of international law, human rights, you know, all the things that we think are modern. But abolitionists are raising this already at that point. And the Amistad Africans actually make their way back to Africa. There's a Mendi mission there run by abolitionists, black and white. In fact, the first missionary association is formed by Pennington. It's an all-black one. And eventually, white abolitionists join it and it becomes the American Missionary Association. What I found was interesting while I was researching this case was the Africans, especially the children who go back and they get educated in the mission, many of them come back to the US, to the South during Reconstruction as missionaries to the newly freed people in the South. So this notion that somehow Africans were the passive recipient of abolitionist benevolence is also not true. Many of them, you know, got educated, came back and tried to, so there was like a transnational circuit of abolitionism that included West Africa, but it all began because these Africans on board the ship decided to fight for their freedom.
Fascinating. You mentioned the opprobrium that is directed at people like John Quincy Adams and some of the abolitionists. Sometimes abolitionists had infighting too. They didn't all like each other. What were some of the tensions between various factions of abolitionists?
Yeah, it's important to look at that, especially for the 1830s, because they split over these issues, right? The Garrisonians become pretty radical because they start critiquing the church and the state. They see the United States as complicit with upholding slavery, the US Constitution. They point to the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and other parts of it. You know, Garrison's famous condemnation in the 1850s of the union with slaveholders and the constitutional protections for slavery as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. So I was researching this, and I looked at it and I said, well, this sounds really familiar, and then realized that it was not original to Garrison. Actually, Pennington had condemned the Fugitive Slave Clause of the US Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement was held, and Garrison just took it. So you had these
Clichism.
divisions propping up in the 1830s, with many abolitionists saying the only way to end slavery is to form a political party, and they formed the Liberty Party. They were the political abolitionists. Then you had the evangelical abolitionists who were not too happy about women talking in public and taking on a prominent role in the abolition movement. And they said, we are fighting for an unpopular cause, which is black freedom and rights. Why loaded with another unpopular cause, women's equality? And Garrison said, no, women were the first foot soldiers of abolition, and I'm not going to give up on women's rights. So they split over various issues. But when it comes to emergencies, like the Armistead Committee, all abolitionists had all hands on deck. And
Right.
that's why I sort of challenged the notion that somehow the movement became too fragmented to be effective. Because I noticed in moments of particular fugitive slave crisis, all the different parties would come together. And this, of course, happens during the Civil War, when there's Douglass, for instance, breaks with Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and moves to the political abolition side. But by the Civil War, they're all back together.
Yeah.
So I argue that you can either look at this fragmentation or these different kind of infighting as debilitating for the movement, but it was also a strength for the movement, but because it encompassed all these different factions, and it did it quite well.
And it allowed for discussion.
Exactly.
And strategy.
debate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, we're almost out of time, which is unbelievable, but I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So The Slave's Cause, really a groundbreaking book. I just loved it. But sum up for us, what do you think is the most significant aspect of the work? I know, and it's a big work,
Yeah.
takes on a lot of nuances and things, but what's the big takeaway?
I think the big takeaway, which is in the epilogue a little bit, is that we really need to think of abolitionists as these forgotten heroes and heroines of American democracy. We think of emancipation, we think of the Civil War, we think of Lincoln. We do not think of abolitionists. We do not think of the enslaved themselves who initiated the process for emancipation. So I really think that my big takeaway for the abolition movement was that this is a radical interracial movement, social movement of ordinary citizens, ordinary American citizens, black and white men and women, and they managed to change the pendulum of history a little bit, right? For a brief moment, they are victorious before there is, of course, a huge reaction to them, which I talk about in my subsequent book because I wanted to look at what happened to the abolitionist project. So my big takeaway is that radical social movements in American history have been really important for the growth and expansion of American democracy, and we often forget that. I want people to think of Reconstruction as abolition democracy. I want people to look at the 14th Amendment's guarantees of national citizenship by naturalization or by birthright as an abolitionist project, which eventually came to pass.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We did want to turn it over to the audience in case there's any Q&A. Yes.
When I come to talks like this one and others in this series and look at the exhibition, I often see the phrase, except in Connecticut. All over New England, except in Connecticut. Or everywhere and finally in Connecticut. Why does Connecticut seem so retrograde? Is it the difference in the economy and agriculture? And what caused Connecticut to be so late?
It's a very good question. Not that I want to blame everything on New York and New York City, but Connecticut is really like a hinterland of New York City. And New York City was a very pro-slavery city. And business interests in New York were very allied with the slave South. So if you look at Wall Street in New York or some of the big shipping and banking industries, they're very much involved in slavery. In Connecticut, the insurance industry, Aetna, they insured enslaved people. So there are these kind of business connections. When we think of the free North and slave South, we think of conflict, but there were many complementary economic relationships between what people call the slave power and the money power, or what they call the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash. These were textile industries in Massachusetts more than in Connecticut. But the fact remained, I think, that in Connecticut, firstly, slave labor was used, I think, more extensively in Western Massachusetts, Connecticut River Valley, Connecticut, and also, I think, business interests, the influence. There's a certain conservative influence. The second thing that I think Connecticut is very late at and very so resistant to black rights is because colonization is so important in Connecticut. So you have these very prominent Connecticut clergymen like Reverend Leonard Bacon, Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Katherine Beecher, who opposed abolition and women's rights. They were all colonizationists, and they hated the abolitionists. I mean, they didn't like them. They felt that the only solution, that the conservative solution to slavery was not just to get rid of slavery, but to get rid of black people and have a lily-white republic. And abolitionists were very committed to the concept of an interracial democracy. So I think Connecticut, both with business interests, ties to New York City, and with the importance of the colonization movement in Connecticut makes it somewhat backward when it comes to black rights.
I'm not used to microphones. Thank you. I never knew that Connecticut, and I think you said Rhode Island, regressed in 1810 and 1813. If you could use the word reason, what was their reasoning?
That's really interesting. If you look at the debates that were held at that time, interestingly, they always argued that this was the expansion of democracy. They didn't pay attention to African Americans. They literally ignored their presence. They thought it was a small minority population, but they're like, we're expanding the rights for white men, right? Now all white men, this is an expansion of democracy because all white men can vote. And this is the way many historians of Connecticut, some of whom I know, portrayed, this is the way they portrayed the 1818 Constitution of Connecticut that disenfranchised black men by saying, oh, this was a democratic constitution because it got rid of property holding qualifications, just completely ignoring the plight of African American men. And I think what it shows you is, how easy it is for people to ignore issues or groups of people who they don't think matter. And I think that's really a problem. Like, I wrote my first book actually on pro-slavery ideology and slaveholders and states' rights constitutional theory. It was a book on South Carolina. And I was reading all these books in South Carolina, and they kept saying, oh, a majority of South Carolinians wanted secession. And they were all gung-ho, and they were all pro-slavery. And I ended my book by saying a majority of South Carolinians did not want secession, and they were not all pro-slavery because the majority of South Carolinians were enslaved black people. They were 60% of the population. And somehow when people read that, they thought, oh, that's funny that she would say that. But it was as if that population, and so in Connecticut, this was a minority population, but South Carolina, they were a majority. And yet, in the political history books that I was reading, as I went through graduate school here, and as I wrote my dissertation that eventually became the first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, had just ignored African Americans, even when they constituted a majority. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for this talk. You talked about the way Black Americans initiated abolition. I am very interested in learning more about petitions written by enslaved people during the Revolution. How common was that? Was that across all the different parts of the United States? Could you tell us more about that?
That's a great question. African Americans were writing petitions in the colonial era already, and so whatever they could do in order to enact their freedom, they would use the state houses and the courthouses. And what I found was black women were particularly adept at suing for their freedom, and black men wrote most of the petitions. And this was really most prominent in New England because of Puritan jurisprudence. They gave people certain juridical rights. Even when they were enslaved, they could petition for their freedom by saying, oh, we are Africans and we were stolen from Africa, and man-stealing is forbidden by the Bible, punishable by death. And that, to a Puritan judge, sounded, oh, that sounds like a good reason to free someone. So these freedom petitions are most prominent in Massachusetts. They are amazing. I mean, I quote a lot of them at great length in my book. I had written an early article on it even before I wrote my book, and now it's being reproduced for the 250th of the American Revolution in many anthologies, because I found these petitions fascinating. They would say things like, we have no country, we have no wives, and we are happy you're fighting for your liberty, but what about us who are actually enslaved? And they're really ironic, they're deferential in tone, and they're very effective in Massachusetts. In Connecticut, the petitions were really interesting because most of the petitions came from people who had loyalist masters who were Tories. And they're like, look, we are patriots. We are for the American, and my master's a loyalist, so we should be freed. And the Connecticut legislature actually freed some of these people on those grounds. So they were very politically skillful also. There was an African by the name of Abda who sued his master for his freedom in Connecticut on grounds of man-stealing also. There are many such cases and petitions, and you can actually read them now. In our wonderful age of digitization, some of these petitions have also been digitized. You can literally even Google them, New England freedom petitions, and you'll get some. And you'll get a sense of what they're saying. And then I saw white abolitionists in Massachusetts appending these petitions to their pamphlets. So they were using the voice of the enslaved right from then. And of course, enslaved people also wrote their own narratives. I mean, we have the Venture Smith narrative from Connecticut, which is quite an amazing document.
We have a Connecticut Explorer published a children's book with Venture Smith's own words.
Great.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you all for coming. We invite you to explore the library more, the exhibition. Dr. Sinha will be signing books in the back, and we have them for sale as well. But please join me in thanking the speakers today.
Thank you.